Howdy, today on Flippin Science we're looking at adaptations.
Changes in the body to fit a location. Adaptation. Changes in the body to fit a location.
So science understandings we're going to look at. Organisms have adaptations that help them survive and reproduce. So you have to discuss examples of adaptations, behavioural, structural and physiological in plants and animals. So here's a question. What adaptations do humans have that make them successful? When you think about human adaptations that make us successful, in an evolutionary sense, it's things that allow us to survive and reproduce. The main thing that humans have is a large brain, which allows us to solve problems and remember things. That's one of our big adaptations. In terms of things like defensive structures, we don't have much. Another adaptation we have is that we don't have too much hair and we sweat, and that means that we can follow animals for a very long time. We can track them, and normally the animals that we're following, if they're mammals and they're very furry, they get tired very easily and they overheat, so that means that we can catch them and eat them. Adaptations are things that are useful that help an organism survive and reproduce. In terms of ecology, survival is useful, but reproduction is much more important, because that means you get to pass on your genes to the next generation. We group adaptations into two big groups. So general adaptations, this is the first group. These are shared within the class of an organism. So if we look at some of our animal classes, so birds for example, birds have wings that allow them to fly. That's an adaptation that they have that allows them to survive and reproduce. If we look at mammals, in the mammalian class, we have legs that allow us to walk. And if we look in the plant world, we have angiosperms, which is a class of plants that are flowering plants. They have leaves with which to conduct photosynthesis. This is different from example from pines, so trees like pines which have needles. There are exceptions to these, because that's what happens in evolution. You find a niche and you have adaptations that allow you to survive in that niche. So there are large birds like emus that have wings, but those wings don't allow them to fly. There are mammals that don't have legs that allow them to walk. So whales, for example, so your cetaceans. Down here we have another example with fish. So in fish you have a swim bladder which allows them to adjust where they are in the water column, so make them rise or drop. Tails to propel themselves, fins to point them in a particular direction, gills with which to breathe underwater with, and a streamline shape to help them get through the water. Specific adaptations are specific to a species, so this makes an organism particularly suited to its environment. And again, another couple of examples. Down here we have a fennec fox, which is Vulpes zeta. It has these really large ears. It lives in the desert, and in the desert getting rid of heat is an issue. So to help with getting rid of heat, they have these large ears that allow them to radiate heat because they have a large blood supply going to those ears. So the blood goes close to the surface, it leaves its heat there at the ear, the heat radiates away from the ears, and the blood goes back to the body and it's cooler. The other main advantage of having a large ear is that you can hear better, so they can hear their prey underground really, really well. So these are adaptations that are specific to the fennec fox, and that makes it more likely to be able to find food and resources in the environment, and that makes it more successful. Down here we'll have a look at sharks, which are a small group of fish. They have specialized sense organs to help them detect sound and movements, and also the smell of their prey underwater. So that's these ones over here. They have large, sharp teeth that replace each other frequently. That means that they can lose a few teeth here and there when they're grabbing their prey, but they can grow them back really, really quickly. And their colouring also means that they're very difficult to see in the water from underneath and then from above as well. So these are specific adaptations which make them very successful in their environment. The most successful organisms are very well adapted to their environment. That means that they have features which allow them to survive and reproduce very successfully in their environment. All organisms are competing for resources. It might be food, it might be space, it might be shelter. And organisms that are well adapted or are better at acquiring those resources, they're more likely to survive and reproduce. So if we look at the polar bear, for example, it has very specific adaptations that make it very successful in its Arctic environment. Its white coloration makes it difficult to see, so that's camouflage. It has very small ears and tail. That means it doesn't radiate as much heat away. A polar bear wants to maintain as much heat as possible, which is completely different to the fennec fox. So when we talk about adaptations that help an organism survive in their environment, we're talking about how their environment has really shaped that organism as well. So let's look at some more adaptation examples. So let's talk about the koala. So the koala has adaptations that allow it to live in eucalypt forests. They have long sharp claws and rough pads on their paws which allow them to climb trees readily. They have a woolly coat that allows them to survive reasonably well in both hot and cold weather. Its insulation in the heat, so it prevents the heat energy making its way in, and in the cold weather it traps a layer of warm air close to the surface of the skin, and that keeps the koala warm. Probably the most interesting adaptation is their enlarged cecum. So you have a cecum, it's at the start of your large intestine, but ours is very small. The cecum in the koala is 2 meters long and it's 10 centimeters in diameter. So here in the diagram we can see it here, it's kind of all kind of folded inside the koala. The koala have a symbiotic relationship with a bacteria species that helps to break down the cellulose in the leaves. So leaves are full of cellulose, which most animals can't break down. Humans can't break down cellulose. We call it fiber. Cellulose does have a lot of energy in it, though, because it's made up of lots of sugar molecules. So by having a really large cecum, koalas can store large amounts of these bacteria that can break down the cellulose, and then they can access the energy from the cellulose. So with the adaptations that we've talked about, we can classify them into several groups: behavioural, structural, or physiological. Behavioural adaptations are behaviours that increase an organism's chance of survival and reproduction. Physiological adaptations, these are internal or metabolic processes that again increase the chances of survival and reproduction. And structural adaptations are physical structures that increase the chances of survival and reproduction. So there's 3 different groups here. If we look at the seal down here, we have a lot of structural adaptations. So thick, short fur, closable ears, a thick neck, light underparts. All of these things are physical structures that will increase the organism's chance of survival. So thick, short fur means that it's going to maintain its body heat. Light underparts make it more camouflaged, so difficult for predators to find. Physiological adaptations are a little bit different. These are internal metabolic processes that you don't necessarily see. A good example is snake venom. Snake venom is produced inside the body, and by producing that venom and then injecting it into other organisms, that makes it able to access food, and that makes it more likely to survive and reproduce. Behavioural adaptations, these are behaviours. So down here we have some wolves in a pack, so by hunting in a pack, yes, they'll get less food individually, but they'll collect more food in total because working as a group they can take down more animals. So that's a behaviour that they've developed. So let's talk about some more behavioural adaptations. So fish producing schools. So a large school of fish, this might be a dazzle display which turns predators away. But also by having lots of fish, your chances of getting eaten in a big group are smaller than if you're just swimming around by yourself. Migration, so moving from one area to another, that's a behavioural adaptation. Courtship display, so we have the birds over here. Symbiotic relationships, these are behavioural adaptations. So the clownfish, it produces a mucus, which is a structural adaptation, but it lives in the sea anemone and gets food from the sea anemone, or brings food actually to the sea anemone as well. So they both benefit. So the sea anemone is quite poisonous. Because the clownfish has the mucus on the surface, they don't get poisoned by the sea anemone. The sea anemone gets something to clean it, so the clownfish cleans the sea anemone, so it gets a benefit and also gets food from the clownfish, and the clownfish gets protection. Nocturnal diurnal, this is when the organisms are most active, so if they're active at night or active during the day, that's a behavioural adaptation. And hunting behaviours like I mentioned before. So here's a cat that's in its pouncing, ready to jump on something. We're going to talk about a specific physiological adaptation in a bit of detail, and this is temperature regulation. So there are organisms that can regulate their internal body temperature. These are called homeotherms, and the regulation is called homeothermia. So homeo keeping the same thermo temperature. You're homeothermic because you keep an internal body temperature around 37 and a bit degrees Celsius all the time. The advantage of this, this is moderated by the metabolism in large part, is that the enzymes that you have, so these are chemicals that increase the rate of chemical reactions, they work in a very narrow temperature range. If the temperature gets too high, the enzymes change shape and they stop working. And if the temperature is too low, there's not enough interaction with the enzymes. So by having the specific temperature maintained, that means that the enzymes work much more efficiently. Organisms that don't have this are called poikilothermic organisms. They don't have internal body temperature regulation, and that means their body temperature fluctuates. It varies with the external temperature. What this means is that the temperatures that the enzymes work best at aren't necessarily being met all the time. So that means that behavioural adaptations, or other structural adaptations, are needed to get the temperature of the body up to the right temperature. So down here we have a behavioural adaptation of basking in this lizard. So the lizard is basking to warm itself up. If it's warming itself up against that right body temperature, then the enzymes will work better in their body. So here we're seeing metabolic rate, and here we're seeing external temperature. So as the temperature increases, the metabolic rate of the rabbit decreases. What that means is it's reducing the metabolic rate, so it's burning less sugar and therefore reducing the body heat that it's producing. Look at the poikilothermic organism. As the temperature externally increases, the metabolic rate is increasing because it's getting warmer, so the enzymes are getting back into their range so that more chemical reactions are happening. Here's some other physiological adaptation examples. So the production of venom or poison. Venom is different because it's injected, poison is just secreted. So here we have the venom from the snake that we talked about before. Kidney adaptation is the ability to survive without drinking water, so a koala is a good example of this. So koalas eat leaves that have a reasonable amount of water in it. They have adaptations inside their kidneys, which mean that they concentrate their urine to a really, really high degree. So they can get pretty much all of the water they need from the leaves that they eat. They don't have to drink from external sources of water. And this doesn't happen all the time. When it gets really, really hot, they will try and find water. But most of the time, they don't need to drink water. Pheromone production. So again, this is done internally, but then excreted to the outside. Down here we have a moth with these really large antennae. This is a male. The male detects the pheromones produced from the females using these large antennae, and then they can zero in on them. Hibernation is another physiological adaptation. It's the body being able to turn down its metabolism to a lower level so the animals can survive over winter where it's really cold. So let's talk about structural adaptations. So these are physical features that are more readily visible, and we'll use an African elephant as a good example of this. So African elephants, so Loxodonta africana, they have these large ears, and the ears don't really necessarily help with hearing. They do a little bit, but the main reason why the ears are very large is they have a really large blood supply going there, and much like the fennec fox, they use this for radiating heat away from the body. So a lot of blood is pumped to the ears. Air going past takes away the heat and energy from the blood, and that reduces the body temperature of the elephant by as much as about 10 degrees. The trunks that they have, that's a structural adaptation that allows them to grapple with vegetation with very high dexterity. They're very, very good with using their trunks. The tusks are usually found on males. These are good for stripping bark off of trees, but they're also, and for digging, but they're also good for attacking or defending themselves. And the large size is a structural adaptation because that makes them they're very much protected from predators because it's very hard to take down a large elephant. You have to put in a lot of energy and time, and a lot of predators just won't do that. So today on Flippin Science, we looked at adaptations. That's it for Flippin Science today. See ya.